Hi everyone. So this week we will be discussing ethics and social responsibility when selling to the multicultural consumer. So you might be wondering, why are we even having this discussion? Aren't multicultural consumers a part of the total consumer base? And so ethics and social responsibility as it pertains to all customers would apply here. As you read this week's chapter 8 in Mueller, you will notice that there are a lot of issues when we think about advertising and marketing. In fact, if we were to talk about the history of advertising and marketing to multicultural cultural consumers in the US, we would be coming all the way back from companies not actively targeting minorities to offering lower quality products to minority populations, in addition to not marketing and advertising to them. And then marketing and advertising changed to more stereotypical representations of this population. And now we are in an era where these groups, not only are they sensitive to representation, misrepresentation, stereotyping, predatory pricing practices, discrimination in so many different forms, but they're also much more vocal, right? They also have a platform in which they can express their opinions, their experiences, which, as we know, because of social media, can spark national outcry. It can actually result in very real consequences for this company. And so it is very important that we actually examine this issue, right? And come to that whole understanding that we have to actually take that extra step when we are advertising to multicultural consumers to ensure that we are dotting all our I's, we are crossing all our T's, and we are being ethical in what we do, right? We don't necessarily use what we know about certain populations to negatively impact that population. So one of the things that I learned in economics, that I think the phrase was "let the buyer beware." And so at one point, marketers were not confined by a code of ethics that basically determined how they would go about marketing certain products and services. But of course, we have seen where that has changed. We have seen a development, a progression of certain rules in terms of marketing and advertising. And actually, the International Chamber of Commerce, which has membership of people from over 130 countries, is one of the largest regulators for companies and countries that are voluntarily putting in place different code of ethics when it comes to advertising and marketing. So, for example, there is an international code of advertising practice, an international code of sales promotion, an international code of direct selling, an international code of marketing, of sponsorship, and the list goes on. When you read Mueller, you will see. And we also have the American Association of Advertisers, who also has a code of ethics that members are have signed on to. So we know that laws are not sufficient, not a sufficient guide for ethical decision making, because again, laws tend to lag society in terms of what is legal and what is not. So because something is legal, that doesn't make it right, it doesn't make it ethical. And so it is essential for companies to develop a code of ethics that basically then determines their organization's culture in terms of ethics and how they go about making decisions, what their company's policies are. When advertising to multicultural consumers, we have to take into consideration there are certain issues. For example, in advertising, misrepresentation. For example, in showing multicultural consumers, for example, and it's not just in advertising but in TV shows as well. We have had a history where, for example, certain groups were shown, for example, portrayed as lazy or as criminal in certain types of advertising. So for example, the Mexican man has been shown as more of a lazy layabout, a peon, in advertising in older times, right? And so that is something that becomes an issue, not necessarily reflecting the daily lives, or basically skewing advertising towards one type of representation of this particular type of consumer. There is also that issue of invisibility, because of course if we adopt an approach to marketing that doesn't recognize that multicultural consumers are different and that they require a marketing strategy that is unique to them, that is catered to them, then we are basically making these people invisible. We are not necessarily recognizing their unique differences, and we're not catering to them either. And that can be just as damaging. Also, inadequacy, right? Not necessarily providing the messages. For example, think about in the Hispanic market, if you're not providing advertising in the language that people speak, then it doesn't matter that you have mainstream advertising, because again, this advertising is not in their language, so they're not able to understand, right? It also could mean, for example, not providing, for example, points of service in their communities, because of course, when you have these communities that are have significant minority populations, in some instances certain types of service providers stay away from those. So banks, for example, right, will stay away from those types of communities, and because of that, you find that the service is inadequate, but also advertising is inadequate for their needs. We also know that, as I mentioned, historically there have been instances where lower quality products were made available to minority populations, right? And that definitely is not necessarily, it's definitely not a good thing, right? So for example, like I said, when we think about the multicultural population, we have to take into consideration the entire marketing mix. So if we think about product, we have to ensure that companies are producing products that are high quality and that they are culturally sensitive, right? And so when we think about, for example, companies that have been over the years the most egregious violators, tobacco and alcohol companies, right? So for example, this quote that Mueller has that looks at when the RJ Reynolds tobacco company, they were interviewing one of the executives, and they asked that this executive if he smoked, and his response was, "Are you kidding? We reserve that right for the poor, the young, the black, and the stupid," right? And this, of course, is representative of some of the literature that basically talked about how these companies, tobacco and alcohol companies, do disproportionately target these communities. So from making these products available in more and more outlets, even more than in other communities. So for example, a greater proportion of, for example, bars and liquor stores in these communities than in other types of communities, right? We also talk about, for example, the in the cigarette industry, where they put a lot of focus on creating menthol cigarettes that are for the African American market, whereas for the Asian American consumer, they do a mix of Chinese tobacco plus American tobacco. And of course, we would think about it and we would say to ourselves, but everybody's an adult and we can all make our own decisions. And so why do companies need to basically think about advertising? Don't they have a right to advertise to these consumers? And of course that is a fair argument, but when you think about it, if the case is that, for example, they're disproportionately focusing on that particular group, right? So for example, tobacco companies have been, not just in terms of hard-hitting ads and using, for example, opinion leaders for the celebrity appeal in their ads, but also, for example, ads donations and sponsorships to particular causes, using their branding, exposing, for example, even children and teenagers to their advertising messages. Again, we talk about also this overrepresentation of these products in these communities, in these corner stores, liquor stores, which are bars, which are much more frequent than in other communities that are not predominantly minority based, right? And so that is definitely an issue, providing subpar products, right? That it definitely becomes an issue, because you have to make sure that your products are good quality but also culturally sensitive, right? We also have a pricing issue. So for example, we have seen where so many banks, even auto financing operations, that have been caught in the practice of charging African American consumers higher interest on their loans than other consumers. The Mueller also talks about Dillard's, which had different prices for styling ethnic hair, right, which was not previously disclosed, right? We also see, for example, it is much more difficult to get a mortgage for African Americans. So we talk about the practice of redlining, where you had much less mortgages being granted, and the terms were much more stiff, right, for different ethnic groups. And that definitely can be an issue if pricing is being modified because of stereotypical notions that these persons are more likely to default, for example, when the statistics don't bear it out. So we have these issues where, or perceptions of particular communities, then translate into company policy, which then translate in how the marketing mix is being implemented. There is also that whole issue of distribution. So again, some brands will tend to stay away from certain communities in terms of putting up a point where persons can access their services because of the makeup of these communities. And that definitely is challenging, because if the product or service is not being made available to these consumers in a convenient location, right, when other consumers are getting that convenience, so from staying away to certain communities or by disproportionately targeting certain communities, we see that, right? We also have, like we said, promotion, representation, right, not showing African Americans or Asian Americans as, so for example, whether it's the model minority stereotype, where we are showing Asian Americans as nerds or as super smart kids, or showing, for example, minorities, Hispanics, African Americans, even Asian Americans in blue collar roles. So for example, the whole stereotype of the Asian laundromat, the washerman or the washerwoman, or the Hispanic person who does physical manual labor, yard labor, the portrayal of the African American as criminal or as a deviant, right? We have to ensure that we are portraying people responsibly. We don't rely on stereotypes. We also don't ignore, right? Because one of the things that we talk about is that the whole issue of invisibility, which I brought up a few minutes ago, right? Not only are we having to understand that we are properly presenting and representing the lives and lifestyles of these groups, but we also have to take into consideration that it's not just about how we represent them, but how much and how often are we showing these people? Are we showing them as a part of our customer base? Are we showing them as a part of the consumers that we value? If all our ads are going to feature people from one particular ethnic group, what does that say about the other people? Is it that we're not trying to target them? We are not targeting advertising messages to them, right? If they are equally important customers, then we have to treat them that way. And that means ensuring that, or advertising is not going to be not just ignore them, but detrimental as well. So think about, as we talked about, alcohol and tobacco to minority communities. We know that, for example, outdoor advertising, bus stops, and the posters, we see them more and more in minority communities, right, where we don't see them in other communities. And so those are some of the issues that Mueller touches on. And the great thing about this chapter is that they talk a lot about, the chapter does touch on a lot of instances where we see these things occurring, the different studies that are done. And so although the information is a little bit dated, it does give you an idea of the fact that this problem is actually a real problem that we have to take into consideration when we are engaging in multicultural marketing. Of course, it's not just a marketing issue. So when we get to Morse and we start look at the make or break rules, you will see that Morse talks about making sure that multicultural is at every level of your organization. That means that it's not just about the marketing and advertising. It's about staffing. It's about hiring. It's about making sure that your organization itself is multicultural. Because again, in just advertising to multicultural consumers but not hiring multicultural, it is just paying lip service to the content, to the concept. You are trying to get their marketing dollars, but your company is not committed, because if your company is committed, it's going to be reflected on the people you hire. It's going to be, your company's makeup is a reflection of your company's philosophy. Additionally, we also have to take into consideration corporate social responsibility, because again, as I said, with social media, with this information age, people being more and more connected, companies that put a foot wrong when it comes to ethical issues in the multicultural consumer space, the impact can be far reaching. It's not isolated to a particular community or to a particular instance. Information is now readily available where we can have access to news of whatever has happened, whatever service failure that occurred. And so it is essential that companies take that into consideration. Ensure also that in investing in a particular community, you're investing in the issues that are also important to the community, and investing in the issues in education surrounding issues that are plaguing certain communities. So for example, Walmart has done an excellent job in terms of their Hispanic Heritage Scholarship Fund, trying to help with increased enrollment of Hispanics in college, which has been historically an issue, and we're now seeing in the statistics that is trending upward. So companies have to be able to put their money where their mouth is. So we talk about the marketing mix, but we also have to take into consideration the organization's philosophy. What does the organization look like on its inside? Because if it's advertising multicultural but it's not multicultural, then it's just lip service to the content, to the concept. And in many instances, you tend to find that the advertising is not authentic. Those companies are more likely to end up in hot water because they have done something that is not right, or that basically comes off the wrong way, right? And so please go ahead and read Mueller chapter 8. This week I think we will be discussing corporate social responsibility and ethics in advertising to multicultural consumers. I hope this discussion has helped in your understanding of the chapter content. Thank you, guys.